Okay, now that we've covered the basic focusing methods, we've covered autofocus methods, and we've covered manual focus, now I'm going to go on to the really important concept, depth of field. Now what depth of field is, it's the amount of your scene in focus from the point of your camera. So when you focus on something, there's a focus point, and then how much before and after that focus point that's in focus is called your depth of field. Now it's not a sharp cutoff either. It's basically, it becomes gradually more blurred in front of that focus point and then gradually more blurred afterwards. So it's kind of more of a curve rather than a sudden cutoff. So it can look really sudden if you're focusing on a really close object and the depth of field is very narrow. Then it can look like there's a sharp cutoff. But it just means that's compressed, the depth of field is compressed. So it's really the amount of your scene that's acceptably sharp, so it looks sharp enough. But as you get to the edges of the ranges, it actually does become blurred. Now, there's three main things that affect depth of field, and it's aperture, it's the distance to the actual object, the focus point. So the distance from your camera to the point of focus, that's the next thing that affects how broad your depth of field or narrow your depth of field is. And the final thing is the focal length of the lens. Now there's a lot of people who get technical about the focal length issue, and they say, well, if you have a wide angle lens and you take a photo with a wide angle lens and then you take a photo with a zoom lens or a telephoto from the same spot, technically the depth of field is the same if you have the same distance and you have the same aperture. But in this course I'm more interested in what the final result is. And the reality is, technically there might be the same amount of blur on the objects, but with the telephoto you're zooming in on the image. So you're taking a small little piece of the image, so things look more blurred because you're actually magnifying that blur. So it's really about the final result in the image. So when you look at telephoto shots and you see like a really blurred background and the person's nice and sharp, then effectively that's a really narrow depth of field. Whereas if you have the same shot with a wide angle, more of it's in focus and the blur is not zoomed in on, so it effectively looks like more is sharp, so it looks like you have more in focus. So it's really the end result of your photograph rather than the technicalities. So what I'm going to do here is I've got a little scene set up here. I've just got those flowers on that little post, and I'm going to show you the difference with different apertures first. So I'm going to focus on the front object and I'm going to change the aperture, and you're going to see the difference in the depth of field according to the aperture setting. And what it is a narrower aperture or a larger f-stop number will actually make more in focus, so you'll get more of your scene in focus. And a wider aperture or a smaller f-stop number will actually narrow that depth of field, so only a smaller part of your scene is in focus. So I'll do that first. I'm going to set it up so that we take photos of that front post flowers at different apertures, and you can see the difference. And then what I'll do is I'll actually change focus points, and you can see the effect of focusing closer or further away on the depth of field. And that'll really show you that as you move away from the camera, the depth of field actually gets larger. And it gets to a point where you'll focus to a point where depth of field will go all the way to the horizon or infinity, depending on your aperture settings. And so I'll show you that first, and then I'll show you with different focal lengths to see how that actually affects depth of field. So let me get these shots here. So I'm using aperture value, so AV mode, so that we can just immediately change the aperture and not worry about the shutter speed. It'll automatically change the shutter speed for us. And I'm using a focus, I'm basically using my focus points to lock on that flower. So here we go, lock on. Okay, first shot. So that's at 2.8, so really large aperture, and you'll notice that there's a really narrow depth of field. So I'm using a wide setting here. So we're going to start on focal length of 24 millimeters. And then I'll show you after how zooming in makes the difference. Now once I've locked on this flower, I'm actually going to shift over to manual focus, so that way we can not worry about trying to get an automatic lock on. We've already locked on, so we just leave it on that. Now I'm going to shift to somewhere more in the middle. I'm going to set it to 8, and now I'm going to set it to F16, and then finally F22. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set it all the way back to 2.8 and show you what happens to that depth of field when I focus further away. So I'm using 2.8 because it's quite a narrow depth of field, so I want you to see how that expands as you focus further away in the distance. Okay, now I'm going to show you, shifting the focus, how that depth of field expands. So now we're going to focus on that second post. Okay, so that's the second post. Now we're going to lock on the third post and a shot, and finally we're going to lock on the boat. And now I'm going to change lenses and actually put a larger focal length lens on so we can show you that effect more dramatically. So now I've actually got a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. So now this is when you really start seeing the depth of field effect, because you've zoomed in on the scene more, you've focused in more, so you see the blur effect more of the depth of field. Okay, so we've got a larger focal length lens on here now. I'm going to set it to 100 first to show you the effect. So now we're seeing a little bit of blur with that in the front of that pillar now that we've set it to 100, and the flowers are sharp, but just the front of the pillar we're noticing the blurring effect more. Now when I zoom it all the way in to 200 millimeters, which is the most that this lens can go, focal length of 200, and we get the flowers sharply in focus, and now we can really see that the front of that pillar is actually totally out of focus because we've zoomed in on it, so we're actually seeing the blur effect more. And of course the background's totally blurred. So for really getting an isolated subject, the trick is to focus relatively close. So closer that you go, the narrower the depth of field. Using a longer lens or telephoto lens with a higher focal length will compress that depth of field because you're zooming in, effectively noticing that depth of field more. Not necessarily technically compressing it, but you're going to notice it more in your photograph. And then having the large aperture. So large aperture, large focal length, and closer focus. That gives you the narrowest perceived depth of field. So that's really the best way to isolate your subjects. Now I'm just going to shift over to the next column just to show you that distance effect again. First of all at 100, and there we go, shot of the next one. Then I'll take a shot of the third post, the fourth post, and finally the boat. Now I'm going to set it to 200, same thing, I'll go to the second post. I'm just focusing on the front of the post because we're so zoomed in now we can actually see a difference between the front and the back of the posts. Third post, fourth post, and finally the boat. Okay, so now you can see when I focus on the boat with the 200 millimeter lens, you can actually see the background is actually out of focus. So now I can really show you the effect of that aperture on this. So now if I go to the other extreme, I'm just going to show you the extremes because in between will just give you sort of halfway between those values. Interestingly enough, this lens can actually do 32 rather than 22, so we're going to actually be able to narrow down that aperture even more and focus on that flower. And here we go, shot of that, and shot of the second post, shot of the third post, shot of the fourth post, and finally shot of the boat. Okay, so from that one you can see now that we've chosen the narrowest aperture, and as we focus further away that depth of field spreads out a bit, and then finally when we focus on that boat with the narrowest aperture, you'll notice the background is a lot more sharper, a lot more in focus. So what it is really there's a point where, a focus point that you get to, where your depth of field will stretch all the way to the horizon, and that's the broadest depth of field you can get in the shot. And that actual focus point, so when you set it to a certain aperture, the focal point that you focus on that allows it to be sharp all the way to the horizon is known as the hyperfocal distance. So that's what you use if you really want your entire scene, as much of your scene from in the foreground all the way to the horizon in focus. You pick that hyperfocal distance. And really it's a case of really putting the aperture as small as you can and not focusing too close to the camera, and it pretty much covers that region. So that should give you a good overview of depth of field and different focusing techniques. And later on in the editing videos for Gold members, I'm going to show you how you can actually selectively blur parts of your image. There's limits to how much you can sharpen. It's hard, if something's totally blurred, you really can't get it back in focus in the computer afterwards. But you can sharpen the image to some degree, which helps. Just those points that are a little bit out of focus may look a little sharper then. And also there's another technique where you can actually take photos of a scene at different focus points, the same scene, and you combine those images and you create a high depth of field image. So it's basically stacking all those images together and using the best parts, best focus points of that image. So what that does is it creates an image that's like just about everything's in focus, even though you couldn't do that when you first took the images. So just stacking that information, but I'll go into that in the more advanced editing video. So thank you for joining me in this video, and next week you'll get the flash videos where we'll give you the flash basics and talk about using flash diffusers. Okay, see you then.